She was not screaming, and that is what no one understood. A woman was tearing her way through the packed forecourt with both hands cutting the air, her mouth open in a shape that should have been a word and was only breath, and the crowd parted around her the way water parts around a stone, annoyed, indifferent, certain she was someone else's problem. I was close enough to see her eyes. I will not forget her eyes. They were the eyes of a person drowning in a room full of people who think she is only waving. I had come to the palace forecourt that morning for nothing more serious than my daughter's idea of a pleasant outing. My name is Edmund Caro. I am 61 years old, a retired clockmaker, a man whose whole working life trained him to notice the one wheel out of true in a case of 40 that are turning sweetly. My daughter, Pell, had brought me to see the changing of the watch because she said I had not left my workshop in a month, and my face was beginning to look like one of my own clocks. Accurate, she said, and shut. So we stood among perhaps 300 strangers along the gilded railings, in the bright flat light of a clear morning, waiting for the guard to march, and I was thinking about a long case movement on my bench, and almost nothing else when the woman came through the crowd like a fault running through stone. She was perhaps 30. A plain gray coat, a scarf knotted twice, hair coming loose from whatever she'd pinned it with before the day went wrong. Her hands moved fast and shaped and deliberate, not the flailing of panic but something with grammar in it, something built, and I understood in a half-second that she was deaf, that those moving hands were her voice, and that not one soul in that forecourt was reading them. A man in a blazer stepped back from her as if she might be ill. Two women filming the gates on their phones glanced over, decided she was a disturbance, and turned the lenses pointedly away. She caught a stranger by the sleeve and signed into his face, urgent, repeating, and he peeled her fingers off his arm with a grimace and said something I could not hear but could read on his lips. "I don't understand you. Get off." That was the cruelty of it. She had a voice. It was a complete and fluent language, and she was using every fluent inch of it, and the crowd had simply decided her language did not count. They heard nothing, so they assumed there was nothing to hear. I have spent my life listening for the tick that is half a beat wrong under 9 that are right, and I tell you the loudest thing in that forecourt was the silence no one else heard. I moved toward her. I am not a brave man and I am not a quick one, and Pell was already a step ahead of me because Pell is both. But before either of us reached her, the woman turned, and the whole front of her body, all of that shaped and desperate language, fell on a single point at the edge of the railings. She had turned to the guard. He stood at his post on the inner side of the gate, beyond the low chain, in the red wool tunic and the tall black bearskin that makes a man into a monument, white gloves, a rifle at his shoulder immaculate, metals catching the flat light in small hard points. He was, to the 300 people in that forecourt, exactly what such a man is supposed to be: scenery, a thing to photograph, a statue that breathes. He had not moved through any of it, not when she pushed through the crowd, not when the man shook her off, not when a steward in a dark coat began drifting toward her with the particular brisk politeness of a person about to remove an inconvenience. The guard's eyes were forward. His chin was level. He was the one fixed point in a turning, indifferent world, and the woman threw herself at that fixed point as if it were the only door left in a burning house. She stopped at the chain. She did not touch it. And then, facing the one man in the forecourt who was forbidden to answer her, who was sworn to silence and stillness, who by every rule of his post could not so much as turn his head, she began to sign. I watched her hands. I did not know the language. But you do not need to read music to know when a man at the keys has stopped playing and started begging. Her hands made a small shape and pressed it to her own chest, mine. Then a low flat motion, palm down, near her hips, small, low to the ground, a height. Then both hands cupped and lifted and turned, looking, sweeping the crowd, gone. Then the chest again. Mine. The low height again. The frantic looking again. Over and over, faster. The same 3 shapes. Until they ran together into one unbroken cry, and the tears came down her face without a single sound to go with them. Mine this small, gone. A mother, a child the height of her own hip, lost in 300 strangers in a stone forecourt with 4 open gates and a city beyond every one of them. I understood it from 10 feet away because I happened to be looking. The steward in the dark coat, 2 feet from her, did not understand it because he was looking at a problem and not at a person. He put out a gentle, firm hand toward her shoulder to turn her away from the railing, and I saw his mouth shape the words that end every such encounter. "Ma'am, you can't." And I felt my own heart drop, because I knew that the moment that hand landed she would be walked back into the crowd that could not hear her, and the small, low shape at the height of her hip would have that much less time. And then the guard moved. It was nothing. To anyone not watching for it, it was less than nothing, a thing you would lose entirely in a blink. But I make clocks. I see the wheel that turns one tooth ahead of its neighbors. The guard's white-gloved hand, the one not bracing the rifle, opened against the seam of his trouser and lifted. 3 inches. No more. Palm out, fingers flat toward the steward. A single, small, flat gesture that every soldier and every steward and every man who has ever stood a line understands in his spine before his mind catches up. Hold, stop, wait. The steward stopped with his hand an inch from the woman's shoulder. I saw it. Pell saw it. The woman did not. Her back was to the guard's hand, her eyes streaming, her own hand still crying mine, this small, gone into a silence that, for the first time that morning, was about to be heard. But the steward saw it, and the steward froze, and in that half-second of frozen confusion, the entire shape of the morning changed direction. The way a great movement changes when one tooth finally catches the wheel it was meant to drive. Because the man who was not allowed to move had just given an order without a word, and the man who was paid to remove the inconvenience had just obeyed it. I did not yet understand what the guard had read or how, or what he meant to do about it. I only understood, standing there with my daughter's hand tightening on my arm, that the statue had seen the one thing 300 people had refused to see. He had heard the silence. And whatever happened next in that forecourt, it had stopped being a story about a woman nobody would listen to, and started being a story about the one man who did. What I learned afterward, and I learned a great deal afterward, because a thing like this gets pieced together by the people who were there, was that the guard's name was Tarn. Sergeant of the Gate Watch, 22 years on the line, a man who by his own captain's account spoke perhaps 40 words in a working day, and not one of them wasted. I did not know any of that as I stood by the railing. I knew only what I saw, and what I saw was a man reading a language he could not possibly have been trained to read, and doing it faster and more accurately than the 300 hearing people around him who had eyes and ears and chose to use neither. I have thought a great deal about how he understood her. He was not a scholar of her language. I am as sure of that as I am sure of anything. But there is a kind of reading that has nothing to do with the words. A man who has stood a post for 22 years has watched 10,000 faces come at him across that chain. The drunk's face, the bullies, the tourists, the lost child's, the worried parents. And he has learned to read distress the way I learned to read a sick movement by the sound it makes before it stops. He did not need her grammar. He needed only to see a woman press her hand to her own chest, hold a flat palm at the height of a small body, and sweep the crowd with her eyes, weeping 3 times over. He had read that face before. He simply read it now in a language that had no sound, and he believed it. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. He believed her. 300 people had decided in advance that a woman who made no noise had nothing to say. The one man sworn to make no noise himself knew better than any of them what silence could carry. His glove came down from the steward and went to his own side again, and for one terrible moment I thought it was over, that the discipline had reasserted itself, that the statue had remembered it was a statue and would stand there and let the steward and the crowd and the 4 open gates do their slow, indifferent work. I was wrong. He was not standing down. He was changing channels. Beyond the gate, On the far side of the forecourt, where a second sentry held the inner arch, a younger guardsman stood his own post. Sergeant Tarn's gloved hand moved again, and this time it was not a plea for a pause but a string of small, fast, deliberate signals. The flat economical hand language that men who work in noise and silence both have used since before any of us were born. A closed fist. Two fingers low, sweeping a flat line at knee height. The fist again, then the fingers spread and turned outward away the gates. A tap to the brim. A cut of the hand toward the western arch. I did not know the code, but I make my living watching small motions drive large ones, and I understood the grammar of it perfectly, because it was the grammar of a clock. One small wheel had begun to turn, and it was reaching for the next. Across the forecourt, the younger guardsman's eyes flicked once to Tarn's hand, and once to the weeping woman at the chain. And then he was gone from his post, not running, never running, but moving with the long, unhurried stride of a man who has been given an order, and intends to be at the end of it before anyone notices he has left the beginning. He crossed to the steward's supervisor by the western arch. He spoke 3 words. I watched the supervisor's whole posture change. The wheel had caught the wheel. Within a minute, and I am a man who measures minutes more closely than most, the mechanism Sergeant Tarn had set going with one gloved hand had begun to move parts of the palace that woman could never have moved by herself if she had stood at that railing and signed until nightfall. The supervisor was speaking into a radio at his collar. 2 more stewards peeled off the inner cordon and went, one to each of the 2 nearer gates, and took up positions that were not their usual positions, facing inward now, scanning low, watching the height of a small body in a crowd of tall ones. A woman in the palace's pale uniform came briskly down the colonnade with a folded paper and a marker, and I understood, with a small turn of my heart, what the paper was for. They could not ask the mother to describe her child aloud, so they would ask her to draw. All of it, every moving part of it, had begun with a man who was not allowed to move, lifting one white glove 3 inches off the seam of his trousers. He had not left his post. He had not spoken a word. He had not so much as turned his bearskin a half degree out of true. And he had turned the whole indifferent machine of that morning toward the one woman it had refused to hear. I felt Pell's grip on my arm. "Dad," she whispered. He understood her. "How did he?" I did not answer, because the woman had finally turned and seen the guard's hand at work, seen the younger guardsman crossing the stones, seen the stewards moving to the gates, seen the woman with the paper coming toward her, and the look on her face is the second thing about that morning I will carry to my own end. It was not relief. It was too raw for relief. It was the look of a person who has been shouting into a sealed room for 10 minutes and has just felt, for the first time, the wall give half an inch under her hands. She turned back to Sergeant Tarn. Her hands came up, and she signed something slowly, only once, looking directly into the one face in that forecourt that had not looked away from her. And though I did not know her language, I would have wagered my whole shop on what it was, because there is one phrase that looks the same in every tongue a grieving mother has ever made with her hands. "Please help me, please." His chin did not move. His eyes stayed forward because that is the iron of the post and he would not break it even now. But his gloved hand, low at his side where only she and I could see it, turned once, palm up, and closed a small, certain, deliberate motion. "I have got you, we are looking." And the woman with the paper reached her and knelt and held out the marker. I will tell you what the mother drew because it mattered more than any description she could have spoken. She took the marker in a hand that shook, and she steadied it the way you steady a hand that has one job left in the world, and she drew on the folded paper against her own knee. A small figure. Then beside it, a shape I did not understand at first, round, with a strap held to the small figure's chest. She tapped it hard twice. Then she drew, above the small figure's head, a thing that was unmistakable even in marker, a knitted hat with a round bauble on the top. She tapped that twice as well. Then she pressed both hands flat to her own chest and pushed them outward toward the woman in uniform. Take it, use it, find him, and her shoulders shook with the sobs that made no sound. The uniformed woman read the paper, nodded once, and was already speaking into her own collar radio before she stood. A small one. A round bag held to the chest. I would learn later it was the boy's. A thing he would not be parted from. A soft drum his grandfather had given him. A knitted hat, blue, with a bauble. Those three things went out across the radios of that palace in under a minute, and the whole vague, impossible problem, a lost child, somewhere in a crowd, narrowed to three hard edges a person could actually look for. A bauble hat. A small bag clutched to a small chest. A height no taller than a railing. That is what discipline is for, I thought, standing there. Not for standing still. For making the right small motion at the right instant, so that the large motions can begin. But a forecourt is a wide place, and a city is wider, and 4 gates were open to all of it, and I felt the cold arithmetic of it even as the search bloomed outward. Every minute the boy could walk was a minute farther he could be. Every gate was a mouth. The crowd that had refused to see the mother now had 300 people in it, all of them taller than the thing we were looking for, and a small boy in a crowd of legs is a needle in a moving haystack. The stewards were good. They were fast. But I have repaired enough clocks to know that the most beautiful mechanism in the world cannot give you back the time you have already lost. Sergeant Tarn knew it too. I watched him know it. He had set the machine going, and now he stood his post in an agony of stillness I would not wish on any man, because the one thing he could not do, the one thing the iron of his post absolutely forbade, was the thing every fiber of him plainly wanted to do, which was to leave the chain and go and find that boy with his own hands. He could not. If he broke and ran, he abandoned the gate. He became one more frightened adult crashing through a crowd. He made himself useless in the precise moment he was most needed as the still center the whole search now turned around. So he held. He stood there and held the line and let the men he had set in motion do the running. And I understood that this was its own kind of courage, harder than the kind that runs, the courage to stay exactly where you are because that is where you do the most good, while everything in you screams to move. And then the search hit its first wall, and I watched the woman's half-inch of hope start to close again. A senior steward, older, silver at the temples, the kind of man whose whole career has been the smooth and the orderly, came down the colonnade at a clip and took in the scene. A weeping woman at the public chain, a uniformed officer kneeling with a marker, 2 sentries off their proper marks, a gate sergeant who had clearly involved himself in something irregular. I saw the calculation cross his face, and it was not a cruel calculation. It was a careful one. He was thinking about protocol. He was thinking about the rule that the forecourt is cleared and order maintained, that lost property and lost persons go through the proper office at the proper gate, that you do not pull sentries off cordon lines on the unverified, unspoken, unhearable word of a distressed member of the public who cannot even tell you her own name. He was thinking, I am certain, that he was being responsible. He crossed to Sergeant Tarn. He did not lower his voice because he did not think he needed to. Sergeant, who authorized you to move the inner cordon? The forecourt did not fall silent. 300 people went on murmuring and filming and shuffling, oblivious. But for me, and for Pell, and for the weeping mother who could not hear a word of it but could read the senior man's stiff shoulders and pointing finger as clearly as I could, the air went tight. Because here was the rule arriving in person to stand the machine back down. Here was the careful, responsible thing, the protocol, the proper office at the proper gate, all of it walking up to the one man who had bent every line of it, and asking him, in front of everyone, to explain himself or stop. And Sergeant Tarn, sworn to silence, forbidden to turn his head, with a lost boy somewhere beyond 4 open gates and a mother's whole life hanging on the next 30 seconds, had to find a way to answer a question he was not permitted to speak the answer to without losing the search, without losing his post. and without losing the half-inch of hope, I had watched a grieving woman win with nothing but her shaking hands. He did not break. I want to be clear about that because it is the whole heart of what I saw. A lesser man would have turned, would have argued, would have pointed at the mother and pleaded the case aloud, and in doing so abandoned the post and proved the senior steward right that the gate sergeant had lost his head. Tarn did none of it. He stood. His eyes stayed forward. His chin stayed level, and his right glove, the one nearest the senior steward, came off the seam of his trouser and made one motion, a flat hand, swept low, palm down at the height of a small body and then turned outward toward the gates. The same shape the mother had made. He gave it back to the steward exactly as she had given it to him. A small one, out there, find him. It was not insolence. There was nothing in it of a man defying a superior. It was a sergeant of 22 years telling an officer the one fact that mattered in the only language available to a man forbidden to speak, and trusting that officer to be the kind of man who could read it. For a moment I did not know which kind of man the steward was. He looked at the glove. He looked at the kneeling officer with the marker and the paper. He looked at the weeping woman who had not made a sound this entire time, and whose hands were still shaping the same broken word over and over. And I saw the careful man do the bravest thing a careful man can do, which is set his protocol down on the floor and pick up the truth in front of him instead. His radio came up to his mouth. "All gates, this is Harjan. We have a lost child in the forecourt confirmed. Hold every gate. No one small leaves this courtyard until I say. Blue bobble hat, a small bag held to the chest knee-high. Move." And then lower to Sergeant Tarn in a voice I only just caught. "Good work, Sergeant. Stand your post." Which was the senior man's way of saying he was sorry, and Tarn's way of being forgiven was simply that his glove went back to the seam of his trousers, and he became, once more, the still point the whole thing turned around. Now the machine had its authority, and the difference was immediate and total. A gate that had been a mouth became a wall. Stewards who had been drifting became a cordon facing inward, every one of them now scanning the same 3 details, every exit sealed against a knee-high figure in a blue hat. The radios crackled with a gate to gate, west clear, no child, north clear, no child, east holding, and with every clear the courtyard tightened around the place the boy still had to be. Because if he had not gone out, then he was still in, and a forecourt, for all its width, is a finite thing once you have shut its 4 mouths. But finite is not the same as easy, and the minutes were not kind. I stood with Pell and I did the thing a clockmaker cannot help doing, which is count. A minute went by. 2. The mother knelt now beside the uniformed officer, both of them turning slowly, scanning, and I could see the woman's eyes going to every small shape in the crowd and finding, each time, that it was a folded coat, a tourist's bag, a dog, and not her son. 3 minutes. The officer's radio gave her nothing new. The cordon held, but the center did not yield. I watched the mother's hand stop signing and simply press flat against her own mouth, and I understood that she had run out of the language entirely, that there was no sign left to make, that she had reached the place past words in any tongue, and I felt the cold arithmetic press down hard, that a small boy who would not leave through a gate might still be small enough to have crawled somewhere a standing search would never think to look. And Sergeant Tarn, at his post, with his eyes forward and his chin level, did the thing that I think only a man who has stood one spot for 22 years could have done. He stopped looking for the boy. I saw it and did not understand it at first. Every other person in that forecourt was sweeping the crowd at knee height, scanning the moving legs, hunting the bobble hat among 300 shuffling adults. Tarn alone went still in a different way, not the still of a statue holding its pose, but the still of a man who has decided that everyone is looking in the wrong place and is about to look in the right one. His eyes, which had stared forward across that chain for the whole of the morning, began, very slightly, to track, not across the crowd, down, and along the low stone line at the base of the colonnade, where the forecourt's wide flagstones met the deep-shadowed recesses between the great pillars. The cool, dim, forgotten gaps where a tired and frightened small person, deafened by a crowd of giants, and looking for somewhere that was not loud and not tall and not moving, might go to ground the way any frightened young thing goes to ground, into the smallest, darkest, stillest place it can find. He could not leave his post to go there, but he did not need to leave his post to see it. And I watched the gloved hand come up off the seam of his trousers one last time, slow, certain, deliberate, and point, not at the crowd, not at the gates, but low and to the side, into the third dark recess between the pillars of the western colonnade, where something the size of a small body had folded itself into the deepest corner of the shadow and gone perfectly, invisibly still. The uniformed officer caught the point of that glove the way the younger guardsman had caught the first signal, a flick of her eyes to Tarn's hand, a flick to the recess, and then she was moving, and she did not call out, and I understood why she did not call out a half-second before she got there, and it nearly undid me. She did not call out because the boy could not have heard her. He was his mother's son. The crowd had been a wall of silence to him as much as to her, 300 mouths moving and no sound he could use, a forest of legs and noise he could feel in the stones but not understand, and he had done the only sensible thing a small deaf boy can do in a place that has become incomprehensible and frightening. He had found the quietest dark and made himself small inside it, and waited for the one thing he trusted, which was his mother's face, to come and find him. The officer reached the recess and did not grab. She knelt at the mouth of the shadow, slow, and held out one open hand, and I saw her other hand come up and make a shape, a clumsy shape, an amateur's shape, but a shape, and I realized she was trying, in whatever fragments of the language she had, to sign to him. It did not matter that she was clumsy. What mattered was that she did not loom and did not shout and did not snatch. She made herself small and still and gentle at the edge of his dark, and she waited. And after a moment that felt to me as long as any I have measured, a small hand came out of the shadow and took hold of one of her gloved fingers. And then she did the only thing left to do, the right thing, the thing that says everything about the difference between finding a child and rescuing one. She did not pick him up and carry him off. She turned, still kneeling, still holding that one small hand, and she looked back across the forecourt to the mother, and she lifted her free hand and made the simplest sign there is, the one even I knew, the one that needs no language at all. She pointed at the mother. Then she pointed into the shadow. Then she opened both arms. "He's here, he's yours, come." I have stood at a great many bedsides and gravesides and altars in 61 years, and I have seen a fair share of what the human face can do under the weight of the worst and the best news it will ever get. I have never seen anything like the mother crossing that forecourt. She did not run, quite, she could not. Her legs would not do it properly. She went in a kind of stumbling rush with both hands already out and already shaping his name, the name no one in that courtyard had ever heard or ever would, made over and over in the air in front of her as she came, and the crowd that had refused to part for her an hour before fell back from her now without being asked. Because there are some things a crowd understands at last even when it understood nothing before. She reached the recess and went down onto the stones on both knees, and the boy came out of the dark and into her, and her arms closed over the blue bobble hat, and the small bag still clutched to his chest, and she pressed her face into his hair, and her whole body shook with the sobbing that, for the first and only time all morning, I almost wished I could hear, because a grief and a relief that large ought to make a sound, and hers never would. And somehow the silence of it was the most enormous thing in that entire stone forecourt. And the boy in his mother's arms lifted his own small hands behind her back and signed something against the air over her shoulder, slow and certain and unmistakable in any language ever made, and I did not need anyone to tell me it was Mama. I am not ashamed to say that a 61-year-old clockmaker stood at a gilded railing with his grown daughter's arm through his, and wept like a child at the sight of two people talking, at last, in a silence that the whole world had finally stopped refusing to hear. I want to tell you what happened in the minutes after, because the after is where you learn what a thing was really made of. The first thing that happened was that nothing happened to Sergeant Tarn. While the mother held her son on the stones and the stewards quietly stood the cordon down gate by gate, the man whose single-gloved hand had set the whole rescue in motion did not move from his post. He did not go to the boy. He did not accept a thanks. He did not so much as let his eyes drift from the forward line they had held all morning, except for that one downward track into the shadow that had ended the search. The reunion was not his to share, and he knew it, and he stood his post and let it belong to the people it belonged to. I have thought since that this was the most disciplined thing he did all day, not the reading of her hands, not the silent order, not the still courage of refusing to run. The hardest discipline was standing 10 feet from the best outcome of his entire career, and not stepping 1 inch into the middle of it. The second thing that happened was the senior steward, Harjan, the careful man who had nearly stood the whole machine down. He went to the mother once she was steady, and he knelt, a silver-templed man in a fine dark coat, going down on one knee on cold flagstones, and through the uniformed officer who interpreted with her clumsy growing fragments and a great deal of paper and marker. He did something I did not expect. He apologized. Not for the search had been right. He apologized, the officer told us later, for the hour before the search, for the rule that says a forecourt must be orderly, for the habit that turns a frightened woman into a disturbance to be removed, for the long, unexamined assumption of every institution everywhere that a person who makes no noise has nothing urgent to say. He told her, through the paper, that the palace would be teaching its gate staff to read the hands, that there would be a card at every steward's post with the signs for lost, child, help, wait, found, that what had nearly cost her son that morning would, if he had any say in it, never be allowed to cost another mother anything again. I do not know if all of that came to pass. Institutions promise a great deal on their knees and remember less of it standing up. But I choose to believe most of it did, because of the third thing that happened, which was the smallest, and which I would not have seen if I had not been a man who watches small things. When the mother finally rose with her son in her arms to be walked to the medical office, and given tea and a chair, and the slow, ordinary return to a normal that had nearly ended, she did not leave straight away. She turned with the boy on her hip and the blue bobble hat against her chin, and she carried him the long way around to the chain, to the post, to Sergeant Tarn. She stopped in front of him, the boy in her arms, and she waited until his forward gaze by the smallest fraction had to take her in. And then she freed one hand from around her son, and she signed slowly so that even a man who did not know the language could follow it, and I think she signed it slowly on purpose so that he could, a single word, pressed flat to her own heart and then opened out toward him. The officer beside us breathed it aloud without meaning to. "Thank you." And then the mother lifted the boy's own small hand gently in hers and helped him make the same shape toward the guard. "Thank you." From the 2 people in that forecourt who had spent the morning unheard, to the one man who had heard them when no one else would. Sergeant Tarn's eyes were forward. His chin was level. He did not turn his head and he did not speak, because the iron of the post is the iron of the post, and he would hold it to the end as he had held it through everything. But his right glove came off the seam of his trousers, low at his side, and it made one motion palm to his own heart, the way she had made it, and then opened just slightly toward the boy. It was not in any manual. It was not any drill I have ever heard of. It was a man answering a language he had taught himself to read in the space of a single desperate morning, telling a mother and her son, in the only words he was permitted, that they were welcome, and that he had been glad too. Then the glove went back to the seam. The bearskin did not move, and the statue that breathes went on standing his post over a forecourt that had, for one morning, been made to remember that the loudest cry it ever heard was the one that made no sound at all. Pell and I walked home the long way, and neither of us said much, which for Pell is rare. At the door of my shop she stopped and looked at me and said, "You'd have walked past her. Admit it. If you hadn't happened to be looking right at her, you'd have walked past her like everyone else." And I told her the truth, which was yes, God help me. I probably would have, because I am a man like other men, and the comfortable habit of a whole life is to hear only the sounds that reach us and call the rest of the world quiet. But I have a clock on my bench at home with a fault no one else can hear, a tick half a beat wrong under 9 that are right, and I have spent 40 years training my ear to the one small wrong thing in a room full of right ones. I thought I had been listening to clocks. I understand now that I had been learning all along to do the thing that one man in a red tunic did better than any of us that morning, to hear the silence no one else heard, and to believe it mattered and to move. Not loudly, not for show. Just the one small right motion, made at the one right instant, that lets all the larger ones begin. That is what the man at the gate taught a clockmaker about sound, and I have not walked past a quiet person since.